shivered. The musty air felt heavy. It pressed down on him. He shouldn't have come in. The antique shop was dimly lit. It smelled like old secrets. He stepped cautiously inside. He had been drawn in by the promise of Halloween decorations. His dorm room needed some. He scanned the shelves crammed with dusty relics. There were faded portraits with vacant eyes. A chipped porcelain doll stared blankly back at him.
Jason felt a presence behind him. He turned around. A frail old man stood there. His eyes were cold and calculating.
Looking for something specific?
The man rasped. His voice was like dry leaves crunching underfoot. Jason shook his head, trying to ignore the shiver running down his spine.
Jason wandered through the dimly lit shop, his eyes scanning the various oddities and curiosities that lined the shelves. He was just browsing, his gaze falling on a mask displayed prominently on a velvet cushion. It was a grotesque thing, unlike anything he had ever seen before. The mask looked eerily lifelike, a chilling depiction of a spider's face, complete with fangs and intricate web patterns. Its 8 eyes seemed to glint with a malevolent intelligence, as if they were watching him, judging him.
Ah, the mask of Arachne,
The shopkeeper croaked, his voice raspy and filled with age, following Jason's gaze. A word of caution, young man. That mask is not for the faint of heart. Some things are best left untouched. Its history is dark and filled with sorrow.
Jason felt a strange pull towards the mask, an inexplicable urge to know more about it. He reached out, his fingers tracing the intricate details of its web-like design, feeling the craftsmanship that had gone into creating such a piece. It was cold and oddly smooth to the touch, sending a chill through his fingertips.
It's cursed, the shopkeeper whispered, leaning in closer as if to share a secret, his voice barely audible. Legend has it, it traps the souls of those who wear it, turns them into monsters, creatures of the night.
He chuckled, a dry, brittle sound that echoed through the shop, sending shivers down Jason's spine. The shop seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as if the mask itself was drawing in the light and warmth around it. Jason glanced around nervously, feeling the weight of the shopkeeper's words. He wondered if the stories were true, if the mask really held such dark power. The mask's eyes seemed to follow him, glinting with a sinister light that made his skin crawl. He took a step back, his curiosity battling with a growing sense of dread. His hand hovered over the mask, hesitating as if some unseen force was urging him to take it, to put it on. But he shook his head, pulling his hand back. The shopkeeper's warning echoed in his mind, a stark reminder of the dangers that lay hidden in the shadows. With one last glance at the mask, Jason turned and walked away, the shopkeeper's dry chuckle following him out the door. The encounter left him unsettled, a lingering sense of unease that he couldn't shake off.
Scoffed, trying to shake off the shopkeeper's words. He couldn't believe the old man's tales about the mask's dark history. Just stories, he said, more to himself than the old man. He tried to convince himself that it was all just a ploy to make the mask seem more intriguing, but doubt lingered in his mind. The mask held a strange allure. It was as if it was calling out to him, whispering promises of power and mystery. He couldn't tear his eyes away. "It's perfect for Halloween," he muttered, already picturing himself wearing it to a party. He imagined the reactions of his friends, the envy in their eyes.
The shopkeeper's warning echoed in the back of his mind. "Beware the mask," the old man had said, his voice filled with a gravity that was hard to ignore. But the mask's pull was too strong to resist. It was as if it had a life of its own, drawing him in with an invisible force.
"How much?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He felt a strange compulsion to own it, to make it his.
The shopkeeper named a price. It was lower than he expected, almost too good to be true. It was surprisingly cheap, almost as if he wanted to be rid of it. The old man's eyes seemed to gleam with a hidden knowledge. Jason paid for the mask. As he left the shop, the old man's parting words followed him into the night. They echoed in his mind, growing louder with each step he took.
"Beware, young man," he rasped, his voice laced with an unsettling knowingness. It was as if he knew something Jason didn't, something that made his skin crawl. The mask always claims its due. The words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a grave mistake. As he walked home, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see the old man following him. The mask felt heavier in his hands, as if it was absorbing his very essence. When he finally reached his home, he placed the mask on the table and stared at it. It seemed to stare back, its empty eyes filled with a dark promise. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, and not for the better. The mask seemed to pulse with a life of its own, shadows dancing around it as if it was alive. Jason took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he gotten himself into?
Back in his dorm room, Jason examined his purchase. The mask seemed different now, more menacing. Its 8 eyes seemed to follow his every move. He could almost feel a faint pulse emanating from it. He tried to ignore the growing unease in his gut. He told himself it was just a prop, but deep down a seed of doubt had been planted.
Tonight was the night of the big Halloween party, and Jason was determined to make an entrance. He held the mask up to his face. He stared into its lifeless eyes. What harm could it do? It was just a mask, right?
He slowly slipped it on. Section 5. A painful transformation. The moment the mask touched his face, a searing pain shot through him. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before, a burning sensation that seemed to penetrate deep into his very soul. It felt like 1,000 spiders crawling on his skin, their legs digging into his flesh. Each movement of the imaginary creatures sent waves of agony through his body, making him shudder uncontrollably.
Ah, get it off, get it off. The words tore from his throat, raw and desperate as he clawed at the mask, his fingers scraping against its unyielding surface.
He screamed, tearing at the mask, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had become a part of him. The more he struggled, the tighter it seemed to cling, merging with his skin in a grotesque union. The pain intensified. It felt like his bones were being rearranged, his skin stretched taut over a changing frame. Every muscle, every sinew, felt like it was being pulled and twisted into something unrecognizable.
No, make it stop. His voice was a hoarse whisper now, the strength sapped from his body as he pleaded for the torment to end.
He collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony as the transformation took hold. His vision blurred. The room spun. He could barely make out the shapes around him, everything a haze of pain and confusion. Then, as suddenly as it started, the pain subsided. He lay there, gasping for breath, his body slick with sweat. The silence that followed was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just ensued. He felt different, stronger, more powerful, but not himself, not anymore. His hands, once familiar, now seemed foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. He could feel a new energy coursing through his veins, a power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Slowly he stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. The room, once a place of comfort, now felt alien and threatening. He looked around, trying to make sense of his new reality, the remnants of his old life slipping away with each passing moment. He caught a glimpse of himself in a nearby mirror. The face staring back was his, yet it wasn't. It was a twisted version, a reflection of the pain and transformation he had just endured. The eyes, once full of life, now held a darkness that sent chills down his spine. Clenching his fists, he felt a surge of determination. Whatever had happened, whatever he had become, he would face it head-on. There was no turning back now. The painful transformation had changed him forever, and he would have to find a way to live with this new reality. With a deep breath, he walked out of the room, stepping into the unknown. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to embrace his new identity, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Section 6. The first victim. He rose to his feet. His reflection in the mirror was no longer his own. The mask had become his face, a hideous, grotesque visage with 8 gleaming eyes and sharp, venomous fangs. A cold, alien hunger pulsed within him. He needed to feed, he needed to kill.
I need to feed.
He left his dorm room, his mind consumed by the mask's dark desires. The hallway was quiet. Most students were at the party. He encountered his first victim at the end of the hall. A lone student, headphones in, oblivious to the danger lurking in the shadows.
Hey Jason, what's up?
Jason pounced. The night was a blur of violence. The mask controlled him. It drove him from one victim to the next, its insatiable hunger growing with each kill.
I barely recognized myself in the bloodlust. The person I once was, the one who had hesitated at the antique shop, was gone, buried beneath the mask's malevolent will.
The screams of his victims only fueled his rage. He was a predator, a monster in the night, and the college campus was his hunting ground. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in the blinds, Jason came to his senses. The murderous haze that had clouded his mind began to lift.
He looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood. Horror washed over him. What had he done?
He stumbled to the bathroom, leaning heavily against the wall. He stared at his reflection. The mask leered back at him, It was still there, fused to his face. He tried to tear it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck fast. He was trapped. Panic surged through him. He had to get rid of this mask. He had to be free.
He clawed at his face, his fingers digging into the mask's cold, unyielding surface. But it was no use. It wouldn't come off. He screamed in frustration and despair. He was a monster, a prisoner in his own body.
He caught his reflection in the mirror one last time. His features were gone, completely absorbed by the mask. He was no longer Jason. He was the mask of Arachne, and it was hungry. A week later, the antique shop reopened. The old man dusted off the display case. He carefully placed a familiar-looking mask on a velvet cushion. It was the mask of Arachne, but it looked different. Its 8 eyes glinted with a newfound malevolence, as if it had tasted blood and craved more.
Such a tragedy, but the show must go on.
He straightened the mask's web-like design, a knowing smile spreading across his face. It was Halloween season after all, and the mask was waiting for its next victim.